I was in Paris about 2 months ago, and it was just a little vacation. It was on the East Coast. I had 7 days off and say, well, I'll just go over there and I'll go to Paris. But let me give you a warning. If you're going over there, here's an example. Chapeau means hat. Ouf means egg. It's like those French have a different word for everything.
Oh, God. That's Steve Martin from his 1978 album, A Wild and Crazy Guy. And I've got a French word for you, too. It's commune, which in France isn't a place for hippies to go digging in the dirt, but rather just another word for township or municipality. Our show today starts with 2 French communes, namely Contrexéville and Vittel, because these 2 have some of the cleanest, purest water in all of Europe, but they also almost didn't. Up until 1992, the farms here, like those across Europe and around the world, had been dribbling pesticide and cow poop into the water, while homeowners and businessmen had been doing the same for crude oil and other pollutants. But then the communes undertook a massive environmental overhaul. Farmers started getting rid of their cows and weaning themselves off of pesticides by rotating their crops in ways that didn't give bugs a chance. Homeowners and businesses started digging up their oil tanks and replacing them with natural gas installations. Today, more than 90% of the land in both communes is under some sort of environmental protection. But this overhaul wasn't led by environmental regulators. It was led by a private company with a very clear incentive. The company was Swiss food giant and perpetual water bad boy Nestlé, and its incentive was the fact that its lucrative Vittel, Contrex, and Epar mineral waters were only lucrative because they're certified as natural. To keep that certification, they had to clean up the rivers that feed the aquifer that in turn feeds the springs that the waters gurgle up from. The stakes were high enough, or in economic terms, the incentives were strong enough for Nestlé to create a separate consultancy called AgriVert, which spent about 25 million euros to help farmers change the way they manage their land. Nestlé still pays those farmers about 200 euros per hectare per year to keep things natural, because it's worth it for them to do so. Of course, the obvious question is, would it still be worthwhile if there weren't such a thing as certification for mineral waters? The answer, probably not. But there's a second question. What if the incentives exist, but no one knows how to use them?
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth, we broke it, we own it, and nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields, and not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature itself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we address it by speaking with my Ecosystem Marketplace colleague, Genevieve Bennett, who's spent much of the past year working with a European group called EcoStar to identify all of the various financing mechanisms available for Europeans who want to manage land more sustainably. EcoStar is about to launch a series of accredited online university courses for green entrepreneurs, be they watershed managers, organic farmers, or river restorers, to help them understand both the business and science side of sustainable land management. If you're an environmentalist with an entrepreneurial bent, then today's show is for you. Before diving into today's interview, I wanted to welcome our 2 newest patrons, Holger Schwendler of Germany and Marcus Toussaint of Belgium. Both have joined at the $5 per episode level, and I'm quite appreciative. You can support us as well by giving us a good rating on iTunes or becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com for as little as $1 per month. I'll tell you more about that at the close of the show. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about where my questions on today's show are coming from, because I didn't realize until listening to it that I was assuming some knowledge on your part that you might not have. Specifically, I'm coming from a U.S. perspective, and some of my early questions won't make sense to you if you don't know how the U.S. system works. Now, I know the United States gets a bad rap these days, and with good reason. We've elected an imbecile who's in the process of gutting the Environmental Protection Agency, ostensibly to create jobs. I'll concede that Donald Trump's policies, for lack of a better word, might boost profits for some of the coal and cattle companies that support him, but they probably destroy more jobs than they create. That's because profits aren't jobs. In fact, profits are often the opposite of jobs. Companies save money by cutting corners, and that often means firing people like the 220,000 people who make up the $25 billion restoration economy in the United States. These are people who earn their money planting trees, restoring rivers, and turning soggy, unproductive farms into wetlands that filter water, purify air, and slow climate change. These jobs exist because companies and even government agencies that damage our environment are legally obligated to make us whole. Under the Endangered Species Act, for example, a local government that wants to build a road through sensitive habitat must first petition the Fish and Wildlife Service for permission to do so. If permission is granted, the entity still has to leave the habitat better than it found it. That's led to the creation of so-called conservation banks or mitigation banks, which are usually created by green entrepreneurs who identify marginal land and restore it to a stable state that performs ecosystem services like flood control or water purification. These mitigation bankers make money by selling credits to entities that get permission to break things. I really should do a whole series of podcasts on mitigation banking in the United States. It's a fascinating subject, and the banks have actually led to the creation of healthier, more contiguous ecosystems. But today, we're looking at Europe. I just wanted to give you that brief intro to mitigation banking, because if you don't know where I'm coming from when you hear the questions I'm asking Jen, those questions won't really make a lot of sense. Also, something you should know, Jen didn't realize we were talking for the podcast. She thought we were just touching base to go over the story that I was working on. But she's a trooper, and she stuck with it, and I think we had a really fun, relaxed, and informative conversation. Now, my interview with Jen Bennett. So now you've got these three separate reports. One's on biodiversity, one's on water, one's on carbon. And there's a lot of detail on these, and I'm wondering if you could help us understand the essence of what you found in a way that people who are new to this stuff will understand it. And then I'd encourage listeners to explore them on their own or to check out the stories that we'll be rolling out on Ecosystem Marketplace. And I want to make it very clear to listeners that you're looking at finance, which I've always felt is the most important but underreported aspect of conservation, because bad financial incentives are creating a lot of this mess, and good financial incentives can help fix it. And in each of these reports, you're looking at payments for conservation, and not just whether programs exist to create payments, but how much money is flowing through them, where it's coming from, what it achieves. And in the case that I think exemplifies this is the one that I opened with, Vittel. I've written about this myself, and I know a bit, but you had a case study that went into a lot of detail, and I'm wondering if you could kind of explain the essence of this Vittel program, how it worked, and what it achieved, and what lessons it gave us.
Sure. So the Vittel project is probably one of the best known examples of these investments in natural infrastructure that we talk about in the reports. And it is a project that is located in France. I should note actually that Vittel has since become Nestle Waters. But basically back in the early 90s, Vittel, which is a mineral water bottler, was dealing with a lot of contamination of their groundwater. Ultimately, it turned out that that was coming from agriculture in the catchment. And the risk for the company was that they would no longer be able to label the water as natural mineral water. So what they did, and this was really innovative, was they actually went to the farmers and said, hey, essentially, if you will manage your lands in such a way that fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides are staying out of the groundwater, we'll pay you. I think these days they pay about €200 per hectare per year to farmers for doing things like, reducing fertilizer application rates or changing the way that they're stocking livestock on the land. And they're also helping farmers with things like buying new farm equipment. They're working with municipalities as well to think about groundwater quality. But it was really sort of an interesting and pretty innovative idea in that I think traditionally the response to water quality issues or water supply issues is an engineering response, right? What new filtration equipment do we need? What new pipes can we put in or things like that. And so here they were actually kind of trying to tackle the problem at its source.
What I love about this program is that you can visually see it, and you had some nice illustrations in there. I think it's very clear and it's easy to understand that the people who get the water are paying to make sure the water is clean, and it also helps to illustrate this concept of green infrastructure that you talk about a lot in the report. Do you have a way of defining, when you talk about green infrastructure? I use that word a lot, and I think I know what it means, but I don't know that I actually have a clear definition of it. Do you have one? Can you?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about green infrastructure, we're talking about the natural systems that perform functions for us that we kind of normally associate with engineered infrastructure. So if you think about how a forest filters out pollution, or how a wetland helps to recharge an aquifer, or a coastal wetland can help absorb storm surges. That's what we mean when we talk about green infrastructure. How are natural systems kind of performing these functions for us that we have traditionally, really tried to pursue with built solutions. And I do want to note also, it's not a question of green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure. I think you're probably much better off looking at a combination of the two. How can you use green infrastructure to help preserve the life of your reservoir or save you some money in filtration? And so that's what we really track most of the time in our reports, are those sort of green-gray hybrids.
And I'm quite familiar with programs in the U.S. and even in China and in Latin America. It's interesting to see that you have cities like Denver, for example, that are funneling their water payments into the surrounding countryside to maintain the forest, because the forests filter water and they help to maintain the watershed and keep flows coming in regularly.
Right, and in Denver, it's also very much a question of fire risk mitigation.
Yeah, because of the beetle, right? The pine beetle?
Well, you could do about 5 podcasts on that topic, what the relationship is between the pine beetle and wildfires. But
just to clarify for people, it's with climate change, the pine beetle mates twice a year now instead of once, and so they're doing more damage and they're leaving these trees in a degraded state. Right? Mm-hmm. That's in quick. Okay. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
In Denver, what happened was they had a really bad fire. I think it was back in 2001, that essentially resulted in so much debris and runoff and sedimentation running down out of the headwaters above the city. I think they had to spend about $40 million to dredge all of that out of the reservoir. And so what Denver did, and I hope I'm not taking us way too off topic.
No, this is great. This is really good. It's interesting.
They signed an MOU with the Forest Service, the United States Forest Service, which is the public land manager of a lot of Denver's source water areas, to do fuels thinning to remove kind of hazardous fuels that had built up in the forest for decades. to do some planning and essentially to reduce the risk that there was going to be another fire like that, that would happen again, another really catastrophic fire. And from the Forest Service's perspective, this was great as well, because they know that they have a lot of restoration work that needs to happen, but the need is always a lot greater than the resources that they have, and they're sort of constantly playing catch up after these fires instead of being able to take some steps to minimize them occurring in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Like the case of Denver and the case of Vittel or Nestle and the Latin American programs that I'm familiar with, they all have one thing in common, which is that the water user is the person or the entity paying for this service. One number that jumped out at me in Europe was this figure of $5.7 billion is flowing into water conservation programs or watershed management programs and all that encompasses, but only 13.4 million of that was coming from users. So more than 99% is coming from governments.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the point of these things to get the private sector paying its share?
Well, that's another loaded question, Steve. But
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Europe, we will start to see more and more water users themselves kind of initiate these programs. Europe has set some pretty ambitious targets under its Water Framework Directive as far as water quality improvements. And, of course, climate change is always the looming threat that's really making water companies, water utilities, cities who are concerned about natural disasters really take a second look at risks to their water supplies and other threats. We have seen a little bit of a preview of that in the United Kingdom, where in recent years, there has been a huge growth in interest on water companies' part to manage their catchments, because the costs of addressing, all of the issues that they're dealing with kind of on site are just getting out of control. And so they're looking at, what can we do beyond the fence? How can we work with other landowners in the catchment? How can we restore the green infrastructure that already exists in our catchment? Because we can't keep up with the problem otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So it's a growing idea, but it's not. It hasn't necessarily taken hold. And I guess this question of getting private sector money flowing in, is that just sort of my own false preconception on what these are for, or is it simply more important that you have transparency and clear results being paid for, and it doesn't really matter by whom?
Well, I think what's interesting in Europe is that a lot of times it's not just the private sector or just the public sector who is supporting these programs, but you're seeing kind of all of the water users and all the stakeholders in a basin work together, and they all kick in funding, and they all sort of can collectively make decisions about what to do with that funding, right? Where are the biggest needs in this basin as far as restoration and protection. And so it's a much more collaborative model than just the private sector or just the public sector. There's always a concern and a legitimate one that you don't really want a private company taking the lead on making decisions about water resources management in your basin, right? Mm-hmm. That's a public issue, and that should remain a public issue. But where I think there is a seat for the private sector at the table is contributing resources. If you are a beverage company and you're concerned about clean water coming into your facility and you want to kick in some funding to help pay for that, I think in the context of broader basin decision making, that's a positive thing.
Right. And another interesting thing that you just touched on is that these member states cooperate across a basin, even if there's different jurisdictions, which I found really interesting, especially because that's been a big problem in the U.S., is that water bodies cross jurisdictions, and they can't even get the different states that impact Chesapeake Bay to cooperate. And here you have separate countries within the European Union.
That is a very interesting part of the Water Framework Directive, in that there's really this focus on managing at the basin level instead of kind of along jurisdictional lines. And so that is requiring different countries or different political jurisdictions within the same countries to kind of all work together to come up with the body of knowledge that they need to manage the basin and to coordinate on management decisions. Those two things are actually really important kind of pieces of the foundation of a successful investment program in natural infrastructure. In the UK, maybe 5 years back, the government agency DEFRA allocated some funding, and it wasn't even a lot of funding. You'll have to look up the exact number. Maybe you can kind of stick that into this podcast later.
Quick interjection, I looked it up, or rather got it from Jen a few days later, and the number is just over $2 million, which means DEFRA, which stands for Department for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs, invested just $2 million, which is a pittance in a country the size of the UK, in a nationwide effort to help people living in certain catchments. A catchment is the area of land that catches water from the sky and funnels it into a river, bay, or whatever. And this money, this $2 million, helped people in some catchments start partnerships geared towards promoting good land management. According to a 2015 report that Jen also wrote, out of the first 20 partnerships that received funding, 17 of them were at least experimenting with so-called investments in watershed services programs, which is the technical word for the kind of setup that Nestle is executing in France. The year of her analysis was 2014.
A small amount of funding for catchment management groups to form. So basically just a little bit of money for everyone in a basin to get together and share knowledge and coordinate on decision making. And gosh, again, I should have checked my numbers before agreeing to talk to you, but I think there, if there were 19 of those catchment management groups that formed, I think 14 of them ultimately went on to support some kind of investment in natural infrastructure in the basin.
She was close. The exact number again was 17 out of 20. Mm-hmm.
And so there was really, from a pretty small amount of government funding, they were able to really create these programs that are now leveraging a lot more money from water users for natural infrastructure. And it'll be interesting to see, if that starts happening on a large scale in Europe as the Water Framework Directive continues to roll out. It's still in kind of the early years, so it's a little soon to say, but that basin-based approach is really interesting and exciting. And I think a lot of people are watching to see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see how that works out as well, especially with Brexit and all this kind of
right.
Yeah, and one thing we should probably get into here, because you've talked about different European Commission directives, and then corresponding member state laws, and we should probably just point out here, as I understand it, the European Commission comes up with these directives, which are fairly broad mandates that member states are supposed to then transpose, I think is the word they use, transpose into law. So a directive kind of sets the goals, and then the law tells them how to implement them. That's, in a nutshell, that's how it works, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, the different member states do have discretion in sort of what, how they get there. But we actually, in the biodiversity report, there are another two, the birds and the habitats directives, and that whole kind of, all of those different pieces of regulation we look at because they are drivers of biodiversity offsets and compensation in Europe. And it is actually a really good sort of example to pull out because the way that those regulations have been implemented in the different member states really does vary a lot. And so what that means is, the extent to which national level regulations and policy frameworks support the use of market-based mechanisms to help meet those goals really varies a lot. Some countries have been much more receptive to using incentives to meet these targets or to enforce regulations, and others have not.
That word markets turns so many people off, and I've seen credible people react to it by saying you're talking about buying and selling nature or selling licenses to pollute. And I'm wondering if we could talk a bit about the mitigation hierarchy, because I think that's really important. You can't just go and and break something or disrupt habitat or damage a wetland and then say, oops, I broke it, let me fix it. You have to first make your case for developing your project. Then if your project gets approval, you have to try and do no harm. Then if you can't do that, you have to make your case for doing some damage, and then you have to show that you'll leave things better than you found them, and only then do these market things come into play. They're like a last resort, and that's the mitigation hierarchy. Now, I know that the mitigation hierarchy is written into the Convention on Biological Diversity. I know how it's actually implemented in the United States, but I'm not sure if it's manifested any differently in Europe. And I have a feeling you can explain first the basics better than I have, and then maybe how it works in Europe.
Sure. So in Europe, as in the U.S., and generally, this is considered best practice everywhere, you still do have the mitigation hierarchy, where if you are a developer and whatever it is that you want to do is expected to have negative impacts on ecosystem values, first you have to avoid it to the fullest extent that you can. And then after you've avoided everything that you can and there's still, residual negative impact, then you have to minimize as much as you can. And then after that, you have to do restoration on site. And then only then after you've taken those steps, if there's still residual negative impacts, then you can offset. And the idea is that you offset at a scale that is greater than the negative impact. So in the end of the day, you have this net gain of value.
So the hierarchy is basically the same everywhere. But what's interesting to me in your report is that you found that most Europeans do these one-off things, which is completely different from the way we do things in the United States. Here, it's like for like, and everything is transparent. So these mitigation banks create these commoditized, quantifiable, verifiable restoration units. And I've always found it really easy to write about them because everything is public. In Europe, or at least in Germany, where I have my experience, they have the same concept, but the process isn't nearly as transparent. I remember in 2009 or so trying to write about a German project up north. I think it was near Hamburg or maybe Lübeck, but it was way up north, and they were building a bridge over some marshland. I forget the specifics, but they compensated it by restoring some frog habitat. The makeup of the species whose habitat they were restoring was completely different from the species in this marshland area. The terrain was different too, but they concluded that the habitat they were restoring was more endangered than what they were disrupting and more valuable and should have a higher priority. And for that reason, this deal went through. And that whole setup, on the one hand, it kind of reeked of the old Deutschland AG thing where everything is done behind closed doors. But at the same time, I can ride my bike across Germany and clearly see that they're taking care of their landscape in ways that we're not always doing. And I'm wondering if you could maybe do a compare and contrast on these two different approaches.
You're right that in the U.S., third-party providers of mitigation really have stepped up and really dominate the space. So mitigation banks or fee programs where the developer can either buy a credit or pay a fee to a program, and then that third party takes on responsibility for implementing the offset, including legal liability, I should mention. In the US, you can also do it yourself, but the regulators kind of discourage that. They have this established preference for banking, and the reason that they do is that you don't have what we call temporal loss, which means if I destroy a wetland tomorrow and I don't have my replacement wetland sort of up and running in a way that those values are starting to come back for another 5 or 10 years, right? Because you don't just snap your fingers and restore a wetland. It takes time for it to come to start functioning. Then you do have loss of value, right? You have those 5 years where those values weren't around. And the way a bank works is that banker has done the restoration work before they can sell the credits. And so the project is already in the ground, and it also, really importantly, the project has already gone through regulatory approval. So a lot of times, if you're a developer, it's much quicker to just buy the credit from a bank than try to get a regulator to approve your do-it-yourself project, right?
Right.
So in Europe, though, we do still see it is mostly still do-it-yourself, or what we call in the report one-off offsets, where the developer maintains responsibility for doing that restoration or habitat creation or habitat protection work. And although, there are exceptions in Germany, there actually is a lot of banking. Municipalities run kind of their own sort of little, they call them compensation pools.
Yeah.
But in most countries, it's very much a one-offs are the only game in town. And you mentioned transparency, and that was definitely something that we talk a lot about in the report, because when you have third-party providers of mitigation, you do tend to have better transparency. It's a lot easier for someone like me to kind of figure out where the projects are and how successful they are than when, it's a real estate developer who's got like a mall somewhere and they flooded a soccer field and called it a wetland.
Right.
And unless I have time to dig through lots of permit information and maybe even have to file some kind of information request from regulators or go visit the site, it's difficult to know actually what has happened, whether that obligation has been met. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of good one-off offset projects out there. They're just there is less transparency, and in the report we really had a tough time in some countries even figuring out how often offsets were being included in environmental authorizations, which is worrying. I think that a lot of people have quite correctly expressed some concerns about the use of offsetting to sort of rubber stamp projects that probably shouldn't be approved.
Right.
And so for these to work effectively, you need transparency. The public needs to be able to monitor what's going on. So
yeah, and I mean, is there any indication that some countries are doing better than others? I know you get into which countries are implementing these programs more than others. Maybe we can start with that and then see if there's a way of seeing which countries are being better stewards of the land, or if there are ways to see that in the future.
Yeah, I think it's, we're starting to see some efforts to improve transparency. In France and in Germany, regulators are starting to make more of this information available online. You can sort of go and look at a map of all the offset project approvals and click on them and see the authorization and things like that. In the UK, where there was a pilot of offsetting a few years back, the DEFRA has been very good about publishing a lot of information on results from that pilot. So, I think it's a process. It's, of course, you're asking regulators to do even more work, which, there may or may not be resources to.
Right. Yeah, and I think the number that I have here in my notes, I think you said that the total value of biodiversity offsets you identified was 95.8 million euros over about 20 years, but you also made it very clear that's probably very low because these one-off. And
I think that is an enormous underestimate of actually how much is probably being spent on these projects. But again, it's really difficult to really uncover that information.
And you alluded to something just now that also jumped out at me. There you had a lot of mitigation banking type pilot initiatives, but are any of them getting traction? I wasn't able to really get a feel for which ones are actually functioning as mitigation banking type programs, or if they're all in this early stage. Well, not early. I mean, the DEFRA one I think has been around. A lot of them have been around for a few years. Are they actually generating offsets, or are they still in this kind of trying it out? And there's been a lot of pushback against them too.
Right. There has been a lot of pushback, and I think that was something that has made DEFRA kind of step back a little bit quietly, but
yeah.
But all of the pilots that we talk about in the report are still in pretty early stages, and so it's hard to know how much traction that they're getting yet. We do hear from these project developers that they're still kind of struggling with the regulatory piece. Our regulators applying equivalent standards for banks versus one-off offsets. In a lot of cases, the answer is no. Banks actually have to meet more stringent standards. And so that, of course, increases their costs and makes their credits a little bit less appealing to developers.
Right.
If it's cheaper to do it yourself, why would you buy a credit?
And that was, as I recall, that was the same thing that we went through in the States, right? The banks had much tighter, they had higher standards, they had higher prices, they were complaining, and then the government regulators come out with this preference for
exactly,
right?
Exactly, and that has completely changed the market.
I do see in Europe some writers who I generally like. George Monbiot at The Guardian, for example. He's an excellent nature writer, but he's dead set against markets, and not just leery of what happens if they're done wrong, but completely dead set against them. And I'd argue that he gets a lot wrong, but he has a large following. Do you get into the perception issue at all, and how to differentiate between legitimate concerns and ideological bias?
So we don't really talk about that too much in the report, although it's really sort of a fascinating issue. And I don't think that it's sort of this willful wrongheadedness on the issue. I think that there have been examples of poor implementation.
Yeah.
And we do talk a lot about best practice in our report. And these are not easy to do correctly.
Right.
And, they really should only be the absolute last resort if impacts are unavoidable, but the project really needs to happen for some public interest reason.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where a lot of the concern comes from. Are these going to, you hear sort of greenwashing a lot or license to trash. Are these going to be just sort of a way for developers to get away with damaging really valuable ecosystems or really special species? So I get where it's coming from.
Yeah. I don't want to sound like I'm Pollyannish, about markets and that they're a panacea and they're going to make everything wonderful. They're only as good as the regulations to which they're applied and to the to the rigor that backs them up.
Right.
We talked a little bit about this multi-country, single basin cooperation, and we talked a little bit about how there might be efforts to bring more private sector money in. Why is the public sector finance in that sector so high right now? And I guess I'm thinking, if you look, we talked about Denver. I guess when we look at Denver, that would be considered a user pays system, but at the same time, it was a state-run utility, if I remember right. Right, and so it's kind of like it's hard to say if it's government or if it's private sector, but it was the user paying, and I'm wondering if we have any feel for why that doesn't, not so much what might be happening in the future, but why do we have this huge amount of money coming from non-users into these watershed programs?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of that public finance is linked to agriculture. Mm-hmm. So there are these agro-environmental subsidies
the
that
Common Agricultural Program.
Right. And so we're not, under the Common Agricultural Program, farmers do have to meet sort of this baseline of good practice. But if they go above and beyond that, they can receive additional payments for things like nutrient management, animal waste management, fertilizers, buffers, hedgerows, things like that. And so there is a ton of public finance for those activities in Europe. I mean, you made that comment that Europeans seem to be pretty invested in maintaining, their landscape values, and I think that's absolutely true. I would say, though, it's the level of subsidy payment for farmers to protect watersheds in Europe is actually pretty comparable to that in the United States. We have some pretty major programs here as well for farmers, things like the Conservation Reserve Program, Conservation Stewardship Program, where there are a lot of payments that are really specifically targeted at shoring up our green infrastructure.
Right. Yeah, and so many of those are of those types of payments are coming from the USDA, the Department of Agriculture.
Right,
which is
right.
interesting. So again, it's the same dynamic, just it looks different at first, but then you look at it more closely and you realize it's very similar. On the climate side, you mostly looked at voluntary carbon markets, which are where you have companies, they reduce their emissions by changing over to alternative fuels and changing the way they handle their logistics, and then they get to a point where they can't reduce any further, so they go and they buy an offset where they'll finance some kind of clean energy program someplace else. And what was interesting is the European headquartered organizations, I guess it would be companies and cities and everything else, transacted about 39.2 million tons of carbon dioxide, or the equivalent of 39.2 million tons of carbon dioxide. So that includes methane and all kinds of other greenhouse gases. But almost all of the money went outside the European area, and it went into Asia. It went into Turkey, I think, was a big recipient of that. Is that an issue? Is that something we should be concerned about?
Most of that money is flowing to Indonesia, to Turkey. The lion's share of the volume that we're seeing transacted is not coming from projects located in Europe. We did find a few forest projects that are taking place in the UK and Italy mainly. A few also in Germany and the Netherlands. And we do see those are actually getting much higher prices than those international offsets, but at much lower volumes. And as for whether it's a problem, I think that depends, on what the buyer is looking for. Are they just trying to manage their carbon footprint and they're seeking the lowest cost offsets, or are they interested in investing in European projects and potentially in specific project types like afforestation and reforestation projects, where you can also get a lot of other ecological co-benefits that you may not get from something like wind.
And that's an issue too that's come up fairly recently when we're looking ahead to a future under the Paris Climate Agreement, is that every country is going to have to account for its greenhouse gas emissions. And if you create a forest carbon project, if you plant a massive forest and it mops up carbon dioxide, or if you save a forest that was already in danger of being destroyed, it impacts your national emissions. And as a result of that, a lot of countries are saying that they might be wanting to promote domestic markets for their forest carbon programs, or to funnel domestic demand into domestic forest carbon programs, also to maintain the forests that they have, because countries all like to have good forests. And for this, one of the things I found when at the mid-year talks in Bonn, there was the Dutch government came up with an initiative where they're planning to look for and promote Netherlands-based land use projects, either farmers becoming more efficient with their methane, or people planting forests and then selling the offsets domestically. Is this something? I mean, is this something you? You know what? I don't really have a question. I'm sorry. I'm just. I hate this when I come in. Yeah. Go ahead.
You have identified, I think, one of the really fascinating findings in this report. This sort of shift in thinking from offsets to climate. As you pointed out, one of the barriers to growing voluntary markets is this problem of double counting. If every country has its own emissions reduction goals, then that means that voluntary projects could end up sort of being double counted by both the host country and the end user buyer. And so there's actually a lot of concern right now in the voluntary markets that the Paris Agreement could really depress demand. And we're waiting to see. But, what we already are seeing in Europe is that some project developers are looking at selling confirmation of climate impact rather than actual offsets. And what that means is there are a lot of projects that we actually don't capture in our voluntary offsets tracking, because they're not verifying projects against an offset standard. So, for example, in Italy, there are a lot of really high-profile tree planting projects where the buyers are much more interested in the marketing benefits of tree planting and in the multiple benefits of forests than in, the actual tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that they can claim. And so those tree planting projects aren't even bothering to verify against a carbon standard. And so I think that's something that's pretty unique to Europe, and we're interested in following to maybe that is one way around this double counting issue.
Yeah, from a marketing perspective, too, that makes a lot of sense. I remember speaking to Mike Korchinski a few years back. He runs Wildlife Works, which is a big project developer that's mostly active in Africa. And he had said that just when it comes to selling offsets, companies have a real hard time thinking in terms of, we're reducing a ton of carbon by saving a forest or planting trees, but if you say, do you want to pay to conserve forest, they're all ears. And there was another company, we did an article about them a while back, and I forget the name. It's a guitar company, a little small guitar company, and they got their hands on some rare Brazilian wood that can no longer be harvested. They bought it. It was some trees they found that had been harvested in the 1950s and were on storage in Europe somewhere. But one thing they did to give back is every guitar they sell, you basically save or plant a rosewood, and it had to be rosewood. But they don't do it by going out and physically planting a tree. They buy offsets. They calculated the amount of carbon in a tree, and I think it's a couple of offsets, a couple tons, obviously, per tree. They use the fact that this rosewood project already exists down in Brazil, and they sell the offsets from that, so they don't have to prove anything or verify or validate. That's all been done by the project developers. And they're able to say to people who buy a guitar, hey, you bought this guitar, it's got some rosewood in it, and you've also done your part to help preserve the rosewood forest. And the actual, when from a carbon perspective, they're putting a lot more in than they take out, because there's no way that the amount of carbon in one, there's not 2 tons of carbon in a guitar. Right. But there is in a tree. And that's
but they're not. Yeah. They're not talking about the carbon to the buyers, though. It sounds like they're talking about the trees and the forests.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, I think that's something to keep an eye on in the future. I mean, forests, at least from my perspective, they're definitely a lot more charismatic than tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And from a marketing angle, maybe that's the future.
Yeah, because
one of the things that I didn't mean to interrupt, but just to add, another thing that we talk about a lot in this report is some of those efforts to monetize multiple benefits instead of just carbon benefits. So, can we integrate climate standards with forest certification standards, or can we align, project indicators with the sustainable development goals so that, buyers feel like they're getting this whole package rather than just a carbon offset?
Yeah, that was an interesting finding from one of the reports that Ecosystem Marketplace did a while back, where when the Sustainable Development Goals came along, and I did a few episodes on those. I'll put them in the show notes. I forget which ones they are. But when the Sustainable Development Goals came along, there was this sense among forest carbon project developers that they could provide a kind of third-party standard for what is and is not a co-benefit. Because when you look at a RED project, they do a lot of the things that the Sustainable Development Goals talk about. They promote sustainable agriculture, they promote gender equality, they do all this stuff already. And now the Sustainable Development Goals come along and say, here's these, was it 16? I forget how many specific goals that the world should be aiming for. And a lot of these RED projects were going back and looking at those goals and saying, hey, look, we do 14 of those already. I don't know if that's how that's panned out or not, but that was an idea that was kicking around then. Now, I know you didn't want to go into too much detail on carbon, because you said that was not, you didn't write that one. That was Kelly Hamrick.
I didn't write this report.
Yes, I don't want to keep, and that was Kelly Hamrick, who we did speak to a few episodes back, and we'll definitely be coming back to her because she's also working on the annual State of Forest Carbon Markets, State of Forest Finance report, which will be coming out around the time of the year-end climate talks, and will probably incorporate a lot of the findings that are already in this one. But I'm wondering, while I've got you here, if there's anything that we didn't touch on but should have, something that's important that you want to make sure we include in this episode?
Sure. Well, I think one piece of information to add is just that these 3 reports were produced as part of a broader effort, which is called the EcoStar project, that is essentially trying to incubate more private sector provision of green infrastructure and ecosystem services in Europe. And they're doing that through university courses, mainly at the graduate level for business students. And so there are going to be courses this fall in Madrid and Brasov and Manchester and Padova in Italy. And then we actually have an incubator next summer for companies or for startups rather, that have business ideas on nature-based business. And so these reports were actually developed to be sort of part of that curriculum and that training. And it'll be really interesting to see, what those entrepreneurs kind of do with this information, this benchmark. Mm-hmm. And it will be interesting as well to come back in a few years and look at how things have changed, whether this project has been successful in scaling up green business in this sector.
Yeah, I know that Kelly Barrett did an article for Ecosystem Marketplace on that program.
On the EcoStar project, yeah.
Right. And I wonder if we might want to revisit that and try to generate a podcast on that as well, because I've gotten feedback from a lot of our listeners, and that's one thing that's interesting to me is how many of the people who are tuning into this are totally new to the whole sustainability space, and they're asking how they can learn more. And a lot of people have asked about online classes. I assume these are not available online, right? These you probably
They are,
Oh,
actually.
okay.
You have to pay a small fee if you're not enrolled at one of the 4 universities. I think it's about €100
Right.
for, but it's an 8-week course.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fairly reasonable. Ecosystem Marketplace recently put out a report on the state of private investment in conservation. And one of the real findings there was that there are, I think, $3 billion something dollars sitting on the table kind of waiting for projects.
Mm-hmm.
The portfolio of projects just isn't there. And there's really no reason why that should be the case, right? There are a lot of smart people out there. There are a lot of business models out there that are working. The policy and the regulatory framework is moving ahead really quickly, and that's driving the demand. And so it would be great to do another podcast on this EcoStar project. I think this accelerator is going to be really cool. We've got an impact fund from Seattle called Fledge that is going to provide seed capital to the entrepreneurs and try to scale this up. They have expressed what we found in the report, that they're looking for good people and good ideas.
And if you're a good person with good ideas, the Ecosystem Services e-learning course will run from October through December, and the application deadline is September 30th. You can learn more at ecostarhub.com/e-learning-course or in the show notes for episode 19 at bionic-planet.com. That's episode 19 at bionic-planet.com. We've done 2 articles on this for Ecosystem Marketplace, and we'll be doing at least 3 more, because I'll be digging into the water, biodiversity, and carbon reports and writing up something for a mainstream audience. But I think Jen did a great job of creating material that's accessible and easy to read. And speaking of accessible and easy to read, I'm trying to create content here that's accessible and easy to understand. If you think I'm doing a good job, then you can help by giving me a good rating on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you access my show. Or you can share Bionic Planet with friends, or the ultimate support, become a patron at bionic-planet.com. Because I depend on you to get these out, and I've set the patronage page so you can help per episode, but with a monthly cap. So if you think $5 per month is good for a 5-episode month, you can pledge $1 per episode, but with a $5 cap. That way, if I don't manage to generate 5 episodes in a month, you're not paying for something you didn't get. And if I go nuts and deliver 20 episodes in 1 month, you won't get whacked either. By the same token, you can offer $5 per episode, or 10 or 50 or whatever. I won't complain. And that wraps up today's show. Until next time, I'm Steve Zwick in Chicago. Thanks for listening.